All right, I'm here today with attorney Erin Schutte Wadzinski, the owner of Kivu Immigration Law in Worthington, Minnesota, for a discussion of President Biden's immigration policies and their impact on rural communities. Erin established Kivu Law in order to provide immigrants living in southwestern Minnesota with access to legal resources. Erin, can you introduce yourself and talk a bit about the establishment and mission of Kivu Law?
Thanks, Grace, for this invitation to join you today. The first thing I should say in way of introduction is that I was Grace's supervisor during her Kivu summer internship this year. So Grace, it's really nice to reconnect with you. I was born and raised on a small family farm near Worthington, and I spent 10 formative years on the East Coast where I attended college and law school before making a really big decision to move back to my hometown in 2018. It was an open staff attorney position at the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota's Worthington office that lured me back. You're probably familiar with this well-respected statewide nonprofit organization, which actually just celebrated their 25th anniversary. In the staff attorney position, it became obvious to me that ILCM was truly the hub for all things immigration related in Southwest Minnesota. And at ILCM, I received from local residents all sorts of questions and requests for assistance, but due to funding and staff capacity, we weren't able to meet all of the needs of the community. Eventually, I applied for the Initiators Fellowship, and by then I had really gotten to know the community and the legal services landscape in the area. I knew the community because it was where I was born and attended public school K through 12. My family near Worthington, or I often visited my family near Worthington while I was living away. And while I honestly never expected I would return to Worthington permanently, I had never stopped calling Minnesota home. This sense of belonging, which I think is really important to reflect on, I think is a very privileged position of garnering community trust and support. And it was with that sense of belonging that I had a platform to get involved in the community. Furthermore, my time spent working in the field of immigration law in Worthington was really crucial in my ability to successfully launch my own practice in Worthington. Among other wonderful experiences I had with Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, I gained an understanding of the legal landscape in the area for what kinds of resources were not readily available, but were in demand among immigrants and refugees. I received support from the Initiators Fellowship to open a social enterprise that would help revitalize a rural community in greater Minnesota. Hence, Kivu Immigration Law was born. Even though it's registered as a PLLC, it's not a traditional law firm. The social enterprise has a dual mission. Kivu Immigration Law provides high quality legal services to immigrants and their families, while also doing community engagement to bring awareness about how national immigration laws affect rural communities. Ultimately, Kivu Immigration Law strives for an improved socio-political environment and quality of life for immigrants.
Amazing. And just to expand on that a bit, as a Worthington native, can you tell us a bit more about the town and the way that it's been shaped by immigrant communities?
Worthington, Minnesota, my hometown, is a small regional economic hub in this very southwest corner of the state. In contrast to stereotypes of Midwest farming communities, Worthington's population is growing due to vibrant immigrant and BIPOC communities. 1/3 of its residents are foreign-born, and 2/3 identify as people of color. In fact, recent census data shows that Nobles County, home to Worthington, is the fastest diversifying county in Minnesota. Yet, Worthington is not unlike many cities who struggles to integrate newcomers and ethnically diverse communities. And there are constant struggles surrounding access to resources and cultural misunderstandings.
Talking about these struggles that immigrant communities in Worthington face on a legal level, are there any common issues that you see impacting your clients and their families during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, as an attorney, I'm in a unique position to get to know many people on a very personal level. When I have an initial consultation with an individual, I'm getting to know how their immigration status impacts their rights, and as a result, how those rights affect their quality of life. For example, and this isn't immigration law specifically, but undocumented individuals cannot obtain driver's licenses in the state of Minnesota. So they're driving to the grocery store, picking up their kids from school, and doing other necessary day-to-day activities in a place where public transportation is pretty much non-existent. So all at the risk of being pulled over for some traffic citation that could have significant immigration consequences. A driver's license for all bill has been presented in the Minnesota state legislature in recent years, but it has yet to pass. And I think that is one common issue that really does impact many of my clients or my clients' family members. That is something that, could be addressed at the state level.
That's so interesting, because in, Southwest Minnesota, it's not like, what a lot of my peers in the Twin Cities are used to, where you can walk somewhere, take a bus or an Uber. Those resources just aren't available, at least from my experience this summer.
Yeah, you're right.
So getting into kind of the main chunk of our interview today, talking about the Biden administration's immigration policies, have you noticed any general trends in immigration law under President Biden? One thing that I liked about Biden as a candidate was he made some pretty bold claims about a dramatic reversal of Trump's policies, a broad expansion of a pathway to citizenship. And in my view, the administration's efforts with this have been pretty half-hearted. But from somebody who works with immigrants every single day, what trends are you seeing?
So I will say that, with the caveat that I became a lawyer during the Trump administration. And so I started my law practice during that time. So my sense of normal when I started as a lawyer was what was going on during the Trump administration. So I don't have a super long perspective on immigration trends from a perspective of a legal practitioner, but I will say that during the Trump administration, and especially in the last 2 or 3 months of it, after the election results were final, Stephen Miller and the Trump administration just took perfectly targeted wrecking balls to the already crumbling federal immigration system. There were so many executive orders issued every single day that it made my head spin trying to keep up with everything. What President Biden inherited when he took office was an immigration system in a pile of debris. And I don't think that those who weren't working in immigration on the day in and the day out realized how much damage the Trump administration did. And that cleanup would need to be done before reconstruction could begin. With that said, advocates, and I myself included, are getting impatient with the Biden administration. What seemed to be rather obvious tactics to rewind some of Trump's actions, those tactics have been paused. And in some cases, the Biden administration is reinforcing policies that Trump put in place.
Okay. So now getting into some more specific orders and acts that I've seen with the Biden administration more recently. Secretary Mayorkas recently announced a new enforcement policy stating that immigration should take into consideration the totality of the circumstances before detaining an undocumented individual, and not expend any resources to remove individuals that don't pose a threat to the country. I'm sure that my explanation of this policy lacks a certain nuance. Can you explain kind of what this policy does and how you think it might affect the lives of your client base?
So these guidelines state, and I quote, enforcement priorities for apprehension and removal remain focused on non-citizens who are a threat to our national security, public safety, and border security, end quote. But I think that the most important message from Secretary Mayorkas's guidelines is this, quote, the fact an individual is a removable non-citizen will not alone be the basis of an enforcement action against them, quote. Okay. So what that means for undocumented immigrants living in Minnesota, for example, is that as long as they remain law abiding, they won't get picked up by ICE on the sidewalk or at the grocery store or at like a cultural gathering just for not having papers. So that's like kind of crucial to know. On the flip side, a small infraction of the law, such as driving without a valid driver's license, may be considered a public safety risk in the eyes of law enforcement, and they wind up arrested and in an ICE detention center because of it. So I'm not saying that extreme spiral of events always happens, but it does happen to varying extents across the country based on municipal and county law enforcement and what their practices and procedures are. I don't see this memo extending to the point where local law enforcement are going to be forced to change their day-to-day practices on a broad level. But it is really reassuring to hear from the federal government that someone will not get picked up just because they are a non-citizen.
And was that happening in Worthington in recent years? People getting picked up just for not being a citizen, a legal citizen?
There were, so not in broad strokes, but
okay.
There were instances where maybe a family, so ICE would go to someone's home because they had a warrant for an arrest, and then ICE would pick up anybody in that home who didn't have proof of lawful status in the United States. So
okay.
things like that had been happening. And I think there are so many fears, and the rumor mill would go nuts where someone would hear about ICE in town, and then people would just like hunker down.
Yeah. Okay. So on a similar note to the first enforcement policy that we discussed, Secretary Mayorkas has also ordered ICE to stop raids of workplaces where undocumented workers are employed. I've heard horror stories about ICE's raid of JBS, which is the one of the largest employers of undocumented individuals in Worthington. That happened in the early 2000s. How big of a concern have these raids been in the last decade or so? And to what extent do you think that Secretary Mayorkas's new policy is going to have on workers' sense of safety on the job?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I want to make a note about JBS. JBS is Worthington's largest employer, period. It is a large employer of immigrants, but JBS does go through pretty extensive lengths of with E-Verify and verifying the status of its employees. So their practices have evolved significantly since 2006 when there was a raid at JBS. Nevertheless, there is still a lot of fear among employees and the community about something like that happening again. So I just wanted to kind of make a caveat to that.
Yeah,
but I was thrilled to hear about ICE being ordered to refrain from workplace raids. In 2006, Worthington experienced the largest ICE workplace raid in American history at that point in time. Hundreds of workers at the local pork processing plant, JBS, well, as Swift at that time, were arrested and sent on buses to ICE detention centers. Children went home from school to no parents, and churches turned into orphanages pretty much until families could figure out how to deal with the separation. Because of that experience, hearing about raids on the news during the Trump administration made it feel like another raid in Worthington was imminent. And sometimes, like I mentioned, there would be rumors about ICE vans in town, and employees would choose not to take the risk of going to work that day. Community organizations like rallied together and had plans on what would happen if there was another workplace raid in Worthington. And there was just the constant level of fear that people lived in because of these practices. So now that the Biden administration has vocally put a stop to that practice, I think we can all really breathe a big sigh of relief.
That's amazing. Must be, yeah, such a relief to know that something like that, legally can't happen again, at least for now. So kind of on the flip side of these, more progressive orders that the Biden administration has put out, Biden has yet to reverse Title 42, which allows Border Patrol to send immigrants at the border to Mexico due to the public health risk of having people, entering the country during a global pandemic. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on the interaction between public health and immigration law, and also how much longer you think Title 42 is going to remain in effect.
Well, President Biden's administration has been playing around with Title 42. By enacting this section of U.S. Code, President Trump put a hard stop on allowing anyone to seek asylum and refuge in the United States. But starting in the late spring of this year, President Biden started relaxing Title 42 constraints and started allowing first unaccompanied children to cross the border. Then they started allowing a very slow trickle of families to cross the border. Title 42 has never been fully reversed since it was put in place under Trump. And lately, the Biden administration has actually tightened up again and nearly fully enforced Title 42. And I get that there are public health concerns. However, there are even more significant public health concerns in the tent camps along the border in Mexico, where asylum seekers are hiding out until they can seek refuge in the U.S. Now that the vaccine is available, for example, I am of the strong belief that measures can be made to protect public health while abiding by international human rights law and allowing individuals to seek asylum in the United States. So, Title 42 is an infraction of human rights and a violation of international law.
Yeah, that's my question, about the balance between the two. I realize that kind of implies that it's you can have more public health and less immigration, or more immigration but less public health. But that's a really good point, that those things are absolutely not mutually exclusive. And, it's the rationale behind that the Title 42, which you just said is a violation of international law, it's not necessarily justified. So Title 42, has a lot of effect on immigrants at the border. In the Midwest, it can seem like what is happening at the border doesn't really affect us day to day, because the border is so far away. Do you have any thoughts on how border policies impact immigrant communities who live in these rural areas of Minnesota?
I mentioned earlier that Title 42 had been temporarily relaxed for certain groups of people, and I'm feeling the impact of that in my immigration practice over 1,000 miles north of the border. Over 100 unaccompanied children have been released to sponsors this year living in Nobles County. And as a result, I have seen dozens of them who need assistance with applying for asylum or special immigrant juvenile status. So in a small community with a large immigrant population, we feel the impacts of national policy. Sometimes it just takes being an informed individual with open eyes and ears to recognize those changes.
Okay. So thank you so much for sitting down for conversation with me today. Before we go, do you have any last thoughts, final conclusions, things you want to tell the world?
I'll just say if you're interested in following what's going on in immigration law in rural America, you can follow Kivu Law on Instagram and Facebook.